The state pharmacy inspector stood in the middle of the community health fair and asked me in front of 500 people if I knew I was dispensing counterfeit medications. She said this while holding up a clipboard with what she claimed was evidence: laboratory reports, complaint forms, documentation that supposedly proved Henderson Family Pharmacy had been filling prescriptions with fake drugs for months. Her name was Carol Williams. She worked for the Ohio State Board of Pharmacy, and she was asking me, David Henderson, if I understood the severity of selling counterfeit medications, if I realized people could die from taking fake drugs, if I had any explanation for how counterfeit pills ended up in bottles with my pharmacy's label on them. My wife Lisa stood next to our booth, her face completely white. Our daughter Emma, who worked as a pharmacy tech at our store, looked like she was going to be sick. The crowd of townspeople around us, neighbors who'd been getting their prescriptions from my family's pharmacy for decades, stared at me with shock and confusion and fear. Behind Carol Williams stood a man I recognized, Brian Foster, regional manager for MedValue Pharmacy, the big chain store that had opened across town 6 months ago. He wasn't in uniform, just standing there in the crowd, watching, a small smile on his face. Carol asked if I was willing to cooperate with the investigation, if I'd provide access to my inventory and records, if I understood that my pharmacy license was suspended, effective immediately pending the outcome of the investigation. The health fair was at the community center, annual event where local healthcare providers set up booths, offered free blood pressure checks and health screenings, distributed information about services, connected with the community. Henderson Family Pharmacy had participated for 20 years. Now we were being shut down publicly in front of everyone we served. I stood there unable to speak. 25 years of building trust. 3 generations of my family serving this town. All of it collapsing because of accusations I didn't understand. Counterfeit medications? We'd never done anything like that. Never would. But how do you prove your innocence when a state inspector is holding documentation that supposedly proves your guilt? Tomorrow I was supposed to meet with our pharmaceutical wholesaler about expanding our services, about adding specialized medications for chronic conditions, about growing Henderson Family Pharmacy to better serve our community. Now instead I'd be meeting with lawyers trying to save my business and my reputation. What Carol Williams didn't know was that I had documentation, complete records of every medication we'd ordered, received, and dispensed for the past decade, receipts from legitimate wholesalers, lot numbers, batch codes, everything tracked and verified, evidence that would prove every pill that left our pharmacy came from legitimate sources. But to understand how we got here, to understand how a family pharmacy that had served the same small town for 65 years could be accused of dispensing counterfeit medications, I need to take you back to when my grandfather first opened Henderson Pharmacy and taught my father what it meant to be a community pharmacist. My name is David Henderson. I'm 48 years old, and this is the story of how a corporate chain tried to destroy a family business using lies backed by false evidence, and how the truth about small-town pharmacy is more complicated than most people realize. I was born in 1976 in Millfield, Ohio, a small town about 40 miles southeast of Columbus, population around 8,000 people, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where businesses are family-owned, where your reputation is everything, because word travels fast in a small town. My grandfather, William Henderson, opened Henderson Pharmacy in 1959. Fresh out of pharmacy school, young veteran who'd served in Korea, he rented a small storefront on Main Street, built the shelves himself, started filling prescriptions for townspeople who'd previously had to drive 20 miles to the nearest pharmacy. My father, Robert Henderson, started working in the pharmacy as a teenager in the 1960s, sweeping floors, stocking shelves, learning the business. He went to pharmacy school at Ohio State, came back to Millfield in 1975, joined my grandfather as a partner. Together they built Henderson Pharmacy into the heart of the community. I grew up in that pharmacy. My earliest memories are of the smell of medications and the sound of the pill counter, of my grandfather in his white coat counseling patients, of my father carefully filling prescriptions, of customers who'd stop to chat, who'd ask about my schoolwork, who'd known my family for generations. My grandfather taught me that pharmacy wasn't just about dispensing medications. It was about knowing your patients, understanding their health conditions, watching for drug interactions, providing counseling and support, being someone they could trust with their health and their concerns. He'd say that in a small town, the pharmacist was part of the healthcare team. You knew who had diabetes, who had heart conditions, who was struggling with depression. You could spot when someone's medication wasn't working, when they were having side effects, when they needed to talk to their doctor. That personal knowledge made better healthcare, made patients safer, made the whole system work better. That's what small-town pharmacy was supposed to be. I knew I wanted to be a pharmacist from the time I was 10 years old, not because I was forced into the family business, because I'd seen what my grandfather and father did, seen how they helped people, seen how they were respected and trusted, seen how satisfying it was to be essential to your community. I went to Ohio State for pharmacy school, same program my father had attended, graduated in 1998, came back to Millfield, started working at Henderson Pharmacy alongside my father and grandfather, 3 generations behind the counter, serving families that had been customers for decades. My grandfather retired in 2000, handed over his share of the business to my father and me. He died in 2003, peaceful death at home at age 74. He died knowing the pharmacy would continue, that the Henderson family would keep serving Millfield. I met Lisa in 1999. She was a teacher at Millfield Elementary, smart and kind and patient. We dated for 2 years, got married in 2001, had Emma in 2003 and Michael in 2005. Bought a house 3 blocks from the pharmacy, built a life in the town where I'd grown up. Henderson Pharmacy grew steadily through the 2000s. We added services, medication therapy management, immunizations, compliance packaging for elderly patients, home delivery for people who couldn't get to the pharmacy. All the things that made us more than just a place to pick up prescriptions. We knew our patients, knew that Mrs. Peterson took her blood pressure medication every morning with breakfast, knew that Mr. Garcia struggled to afford his diabetes medications and helped him find manufacturer assistance programs, knew that the Johnson's daughter had severe allergies and kept her EpiPen prescription current. That knowledge saved lives. Multiple times, I caught a dangerous drug interaction that a new doctor had missed because he didn't know the patient's full medication history. Lisa spotted that an elderly patient was taking her husband's heart medication by mistake because the bottles looked similar. My father identified early signs of medication non-adherence in a diabetic patient and intervened before it became a crisis. That's what small-town pharmacy could do. That's what made us valuable beyond just the pills we dispensed. But the industry was changing. Big chain pharmacies were expanding everywhere. CVS, Walgreens, Rite Aid. They had advantages we couldn't match. Lower prices through bulk purchasing, extensive insurance networks, extended hours, drive-through windows, convenience and cost that made them attractive to many customers. We lost some business to chains, people who prioritized price or convenience over personal service. But we kept our core customers, people who valued knowing their pharmacist, who wanted someone who recognized them and understood their health history, who appreciated that we deliver medications to their house if they were too sick to come in. My father retired in 2015, sold me his share of the pharmacy, moved to Florida with my mother. Warm weather and golf. He'd earned it after 40 years behind the counter. He left knowing Henderson Pharmacy was in good hands. I became the sole owner at age 39, felt the weight of that responsibility. 3 generations of family history, 65 years of community trust, hundreds of patients depending on us. Emma had started working as a pharmacy tech, already talking about going to pharmacy school. The tradition might continue into a 4th generation. Business was steady through the late 2010s, not growing dramatically but sustainable. We served our community, made a decent living, employed 6 people, contributed to the local economy, everything a family business should be. Then, in January of this year, MedValue Pharmacy opened across town. MedValue was a regional chain, 20 stores across Ohio and Pennsylvania, not as big as CVS or Walgreens, but big enough to have corporate infrastructure and buying power. They'd been expanding into small towns, finding locations where they could compete with independent pharmacies. They opened in a new shopping plaza on the highway. Modern building, large parking lot, drive-through window, open until 9 p.m. weekdays and 6 p.m. weekends. Everything designed for convenience. Their regional manager was Brian Foster, mid-40s, corporate type. He'd stopped by Henderson Pharmacy before they opened, said he wanted to introduce himself, said there was room for both pharmacies in town, said he hoped we could coexist peacefully. I was polite, but skeptical. Corporate chains didn't expand into small towns planning to coexist peacefully. They expanded planning to dominate, to undercut on price until the competition closed, then raise prices once they had a monopoly. Brian said I was being cynical, said MedValue wasn't like that, said they just wanted to serve customers who preferred chain pharmacy convenience, said independent pharmacies that provided good service would be fine. I wanted to believe him, but I'd heard stories from other independent pharmacists about how chains moved into small towns, how they operated at a loss initially to steal customers, how they used their insurance networks to steer patients away from independents, how they waited for the local pharmacy to close, then raised prices and reduced services. MedValue's opening hit us hard. We lost about 20% of our prescription volume in the first 3 months. Some customers switched for the lower prices, some for the extended hours, some just because it was new and convenient. But we kept our core customers, the people who valued personal service, who wanted a pharmacist who knew them, who appreciated that we'd spend time counseling them about their medications instead of just handing them a bag and moving them through the line. We adapted, extended our hours slightly, improved our delivery service, started offering medication synchronization so patients could pick up all their prescriptions at once, competed on service since we couldn't compete on price. By April, we'd stabilized, still down from our previous volume but sustainable. MedValue had taken the customers they were going to take. We'd kept the customers who valued what we offered. The town was big enough for both pharmacies. Barely, but enough. Then Brian Foster started visiting our customers. I heard about it from Mrs. Peterson. She came in to pick up her blood pressure medication. Said a man from MedValue had visited her house, had reviewed her medications, had told her that MedValue could save her money and provide better service, had encouraged her to switch her prescriptions to MedValue. I was shocked. Corporate pharmacies didn't do house calls, didn't visit customers uninvited. That was aggressive marketing that crossed lines of professionalism. Mrs. Peterson said the man had been polite but insistent, had implied that small pharmacies like ours couldn't match the quality and safety of corporate chains, had suggested that larger pharmacies had better systems to prevent errors. She'd sent him away, told him she'd been a Henderson pharmacy customer for 40 years and wasn't switching, but she wanted me to know what MedValue was doing. Over the next few weeks, I heard similar stories. Brian, or someone from his staff, visiting elderly customers, visiting chronic disease patients, offering free medication reviews, using the visits to pitch MedValue and criticize independent pharmacies. It was unethical, using healthcare consultations as disguised sales calls, taking advantage of vulnerable patients. But it wasn't technically illegal, just aggressive business practices that made me uncomfortable. We lost a few more customers from those visits, people who were convinced by MedValue's pitch, who believed bigger was safer, who thought corporate systems were more reliable than a family pharmacy's personal attention. Then, in May, something stranger happened. A customer returned a prescription, said the pills looked wrong, different color than what she usually got, wanted me to check if there was a problem. I looked at the bottle. Henderson Pharmacy label, the correct drug and strength. But when I opened it, the pills inside were definitely wrong. Different color, different shape, different markings than what the label indicated. I checked our records. The prescription had been filled 2 weeks earlier, but I couldn't find any record of us actually dispensing it. The bottle had our label, but it wasn't in our system, like someone had printed a Henderson Pharmacy label and put it on a bottle we'd never actually filled. I told the customer there was obviously an error, that these weren't the pills we'd dispensed, that I'd fill the prescription correctly right now at no charge, that I was sorry for the confusion. She was understanding. Mistakes happen, but I was disturbed. How had a bottle with our label ended up with wrong pills inside? Had we made an error? Had someone tampered with the bottle after it left our pharmacy? I reviewed our procedures with the staff, checked our inventory. Everything seemed in order. I wrote it off as a bizarre, one-time mistake. Maybe a labeling error. Maybe the customer got bottles mixed up somehow. Then it happened again 2 weeks later. Different customer, different medication, but same problem. Pills inside didn't match our label. No record in our system of filling that prescription. Now I was worried. 2 incidents in 2 weeks wasn't coincidence. Something was wrong. Either we had a serious problem with our dispensing procedures, or someone was deliberately creating fake prescriptions with our labels. I filed an incident report with my liability insurance, started reviewing our security procedures, checked our surveillance cameras. Everything looked normal. No signs of anyone tampering with medications or stealing labels. Then, in June, I got a call from the State Board of Pharmacy. A complaint had been filed. A patient claimed she'd gotten the wrong medication from Henderson Pharmacy, said the pills in the bottle didn't match the label, said she'd taken them for several days before realizing something was wrong. I explained the situation, that we'd had 2 similar incidents, that I suspected someone was creating counterfeit bottles with our labels, that our records showed we'd never actually filled those prescriptions. The investigator was skeptical, said counterfeit prescription bottles was an unusual claim, said the simpler explanation was dispensing errors, said they'd need to investigate. I provided all our records, showed that the prescriptions in question weren't in our system, showed our inventory controls and quality assurance procedures, explained that our pharmacy had operated for 65 years without serious safety incidents. The investigator said they'd look into it, but I could tell she thought I was making excuses for sloppy procedures, that the counterfeit bottle theory seemed far-fetched. More bottles appeared over the next month. Always the same pattern. Henderson Pharmacy label. Wrong pills inside. No record of us dispensing it. Different patients each time. All of them elderly or chronic disease patients. All of them also customers that Brian Foster's team had visited. That's when I started to understand. This wasn't accidents. This was sabotage. Someone was creating fake prescription bottles with our labels, filling them with wrong medications, getting them to our customers somehow, making it look like Henderson Pharmacy was making dangerous dispensing errors. But I couldn't prove it, had no evidence of how the bottles were being created or distributed, just a pattern that suggested something deliberate was happening. I hired a private investigator, former police detective named Marcus Webb, explained the situation, asked him to look into MedValue and Brian Foster, see if there was any connection to the counterfeit bottles. Marcus found some interesting things. MedValue was under pressure from corporate. They'd expanded too aggressively. Several locations were losing money. Corporate was demanding that underperforming stores show dramatic improvement or face closure. The Millfield MedValue was one of the underperforming stores. They'd projected capturing 60% of the local market within a year. They'd captured maybe 30%. Not enough. Brian Foster was on notice that his store needed to improve dramatically, or it would be closed. Marcus also found that Brian had a history. At his previous location, the local independent pharmacy had closed after a series of safety complaints. After it closed, those complaints mysteriously stopped. MedValue had taken over most of that town's pharmacy business. Similar pattern at another location. Independent pharmacy accused of safety violations. Investigation. Closure. MedValue benefited. Almost like Brian had a playbook for eliminating competition, but Marcus couldn't find direct evidence. No proof that Brian was creating the counterfeit bottles. No witnesses, no documentation. Just a suspicious pattern. Then, in July, things escalated. A patient had a serious adverse reaction. Took medication she thought was her usual prescription. Had a severe allergic reaction. Ended up hospitalized for 3 days. Nearly died. The bottle had a Henderson Pharmacy label, but the pills inside weren't what the label said. They were a completely different medication. A medication this patient was allergic to. The State Board of Pharmacy opened a formal investigation. The patient's family hired a lawyer. Talk of a lawsuit, talk of criminal charges. My liability insurance company was panicking. I showed investigators our records. We'd never filled that prescription. The patient wasn't even in our system. We'd never served her. The bottle was a complete fake. But the investigators were skeptical. Said our records could have been altered. Said the bottle looked authentic. Said counterfeit prescription conspiracy theories weren't credible explanations. They suspended my license pending the outcome of the investigation. Said I couldn't operate until the safety concerns were resolved. 65 years of family business shut down because of bottles I was certain we'd never actually filled. I got a lawyer, Thomas Burke, specialized in professional licensing defense. He reviewed everything, said we had a good defense, that the evidence showed the bottles weren't actually from our pharmacy, that the pattern suggested sabotage rather than dispensing errors. But he also said perception mattered, that once a pharmacy was accused of safety violations, even if they were ultimately exonerated, the damage to reputation was often fatal. that patients wouldn't come back if they thought their pharmacy wasn't safe. Thomas started his own investigation, hired forensic experts to examine the labels on the fake bottles. They found something interesting. The labels were printed on the same type of label stock we used, but the print quality was slightly different. The font weight was slightly off, like someone had recreated our label design but printed it on different equipment. Thomas subpoenaed MedValue's printer inventory, found they had a high-quality label printer capable of creating pharmacy labels. Not unusual. Pharmacies need label printers, but it meant they had the equipment to create fake Henderson pharmacy labels. But that didn't prove they'd actually done it, just that they could have. We needed more evidence, needed to catch someone in the act, needed to prove the counterfeit bottles were being created and distributed deliberately. Marcus had an idea. He'd noticed that all the fake bottles had been discovered by patients who lived in specific parts of town, elderly neighborhoods, areas where MedValue's salespeople had been visiting, areas where they'd been doing those free medication reviews. What if the medication reviews were the distribution method? What if Brian's team was visiting patients, doing a review, and switching out real Henderson pharmacy bottles with fake ones, making it look like we'd dispensed wrong medications? It was a theory, but we needed proof. Marcus set up surveillance, watched Brian and his staff, followed them when they went on their medication review visits, documented their routes and timing, and he caught something. One of Brian's pharmacy technicians, a woman named Ashley, visiting an elderly patient, going inside with a briefcase, staying for 30 minutes, coming out without the briefcase, coming back 2 hours later to retrieve it. Marcus talked to the patient afterward, asked about the visit. The patient said Ashley had done a medication review, had looked at all his prescriptions, had made recommendations, had been very thorough and helpful. Had she touched any of his bottles from Henderson Pharmacy? Yes, she'd examined them all. Had any of those bottles been in her briefcase at any point? He wasn't sure. Maybe. It had all happened quickly. We had a theory, but still no proof. Still no direct evidence of bottles being switched. That's when Thomas had an idea. A sting operation. We'd create a controlled situation where we could catch them in the act. We recruited a volunteer, Martha Green, an elderly widow who was one of our longtime customers. She understood what was happening, was angry that someone was trying to destroy Henderson Pharmacy, wanted to help. Martha called MedValue, said she'd heard they offered free medication reviews, said she'd like someone to come to her house and review her prescriptions, made an appointment for the following week. Before the appointment, we prepared. Martha's medications were all from Henderson Pharmacy. We photographed every bottle, every label, every pill inside, documented everything. We also put tiny invisible markers on the bottles, special ink that would fluoresce under UV light, marked each bottle in a unique pattern. Then we set up surveillance, cameras hidden in Martha's living room, Marcus watching from a van down the street, everything documented and recorded. Ashley from MedValue arrived right on time, did a medication review with Martha, asked about her health conditions, reviewed her prescriptions, made recommendations. Very professional. And during the review, when Martha went to the bathroom, Ashley did something suspicious. She pulled bottles out of her bag, Henderson Pharmacy labels, swapped them with Martha's actual bottles, took the real bottles, left fake ones, quick and practiced, like she'd done it many times before. We had her on camera, clear footage of her switching the bottles, clear evidence of the sabotage we'd been claiming. Marcus confronted her when she left, showed her the footage. Ashley panicked, started crying, said she was just following orders, that Brian Foster had told her to do it, that he'd said it was necessary to eliminate the competition, that she didn't want to, but needed her job. She confessed everything, recorded confession on Marcus's phone, said Brian had been running this scheme for months, creating fake Henderson Pharmacy bottles, filling them with wrong medications or placebos, distributing them to patients during medication reviews, making it look like Henderson Pharmacy was dangerous and incompetent. The goal was to destroy our reputation, drive us out of business, leave MedValue as the only pharmacy in town. We had everything we needed: video evidence, recorded confession, physical evidence of the fake bottles, proof of the sabotage scheme. Thomas immediately filed a complaint with the State Board of Pharmacy, provided all the evidence, demanded that my license suspension be lifted and that MedValue and Brian Foster be investigated. He also filed a lawsuit against MedValue, defamation, tortious interference with business, fraud, seeking damages for the harm they'd done to Henderson Pharmacy. The State Board moved quickly once they saw the evidence, lifted my license suspension, opened an investigation into MedValue, suspended Brian Foster's pharmacy license, ordered MedValue to cease all operations pending the investigation. But the damage was done. Henderson Pharmacy had been closed for 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, our customers had gone to MedValue or other pharmacies. They'd established new relationships, new routines. And even though we were now vindicated, even though evidence proved the safety violations were sabotage rather than actual errors, people remembered the accusations, remembered that Henderson Pharmacy had been investigated, wondered if maybe there was some truth to the safety concerns. That's the thing about reputation. It takes years to build and moments to destroy. Even when you're proven innocent, the suspicion lingers. We reopened Henderson Pharmacy in early August. I expected customers to come flooding back, to be outraged by what MedValue had done, to support the family pharmacy that had served them for decades. Some did. Our most loyal customers came back immediately, apologized for doubting us, said they should have known we'd never do anything to compromise patient safety. But many didn't come back, found it more convenient to stay at CVS or Walgreens where they'd transferred their prescriptions, didn't want to deal with switching back, didn't want to risk that maybe Henderson Pharmacy really did have problems, even though we'd been exonerated. Our prescription volume was down 40% from before the accusations. We'd lost nearly half our business. We were barely breaking even, couldn't sustain that long term. Lisa was worried, said maybe it was time to consider selling, that we couldn't rebuild from this, that the damage was too severe, that 65 years was a good run, but maybe it was time to close. Emma was devastated, said she'd been planning her future around pharmacy school and eventually taking over Henderson Pharmacy, said she didn't know what she'd do if we closed. I was angry that Brian Foster's scheme had almost worked, that even though we'd proven his fraud, the damage to our reputation might still destroy us. That truth and evidence weren't enough to overcome perception and suspicion. The lawsuit was moving forward. Thomas said we had a strong case, that the evidence was overwhelming, that we'd likely win substantial damages, that MedValue and Brian would face consequences. But a lawsuit takes time, months or years, and we needed customers now, needed to rebuild our business, needed to restore trust. That's when Thomas had another idea. Go public, tell the whole story, show people exactly what MedValue had done and how we'd proven it. Let the community see the evidence. We scheduled a town hall meeting at the community center, invited everyone, sent notices to every household in Millfield, said we wanted to share the truth about what had happened to Henderson Pharmacy. The meeting was scheduled for August 15th. 2 weeks to prepare, 2 weeks to organize our presentation, 2 weeks to get ready to defend ourselves publicly. But then something changed the timeline. The Millfield Community Health Fair, annual event the third Saturday in August. Every healthcare provider in town had a booth. Thousands of people attended. Henderson Pharmacy always had a booth, offered free health screenings, distributed information about our services, connected with the community. We'd planned to participate this year to show we were back and operating normally. But the day before the health fair, Thomas got a tip. The State Board of Pharmacy inspector would be there, Carol Williams. She was planning to publicly announce new findings in the Henderson Pharmacy investigation, planning to make some kind of statement about pharmacy safety. Thomas didn't know what she was planning to say. Couldn't get information from the board, but he was worried. Said timing seemed suspicious. Said we should be prepared for anything. The health fair started at 9 a.m. We set up our booth, offered blood pressure checks and medication reviews, tried to act normal, tried to be confident. Around 10 a.m., Carol Williams arrived. She walked straight to our booth, didn't say hello, didn't make small talk, just asked if I was David Henderson. I said yes. She said she needed to speak with me publicly, that there were serious concerns about my pharmacy's operations, that the community deserved to know the truth. That's when I saw Brian Foster, standing in the crowd, watching with that same small smile he'd had the day MedValue opened, like he was enjoying this, like he'd orchestrated it. Carol pulled out her clipboard, started talking loudly so people nearby could hear, said she'd received new reports of counterfeit medications from Henderson Pharmacy, said the investigation had found serious safety concerns, said my license was being suspended again, pending further review. People started gathering. Within minutes, there were 50 people around our booth, then 100. Lisa looked terrified. Emma was crying. Our reputation was being destroyed in front of everyone. Carol asked if I understood I was dispensing counterfeit medications, if I realized people could die. If I had any explanation, I stood there frozen. This was supposed to be over. We'd proven the sabotage. We'd cleared our name. But here was a state inspector making the same accusations again, creating a public spectacle that would destroy what little reputation we had left. And that's when I realized what was happening. Brian had gotten to Carol somehow, had convinced her to make this public statement, had created one more theatrical moment to destroy Henderson Pharmacy, had turned a state inspector into a weapon against us. But I also realized something else. Carol had made a mistake. She'd chosen to do this publicly, in front of hundreds of people. That meant I could respond publicly too, could present our evidence in front of the same crowd, could expose the truth in the same theatrical way she'd tried to destroy us. I pulled out my phone, called Thomas, told him what was happening. He said he was 15 minutes away, could bring all our documentation, could turn this public accusation into a public vindication. I looked at Carol, told her I'd be happy to cooperate with her investigation, that I had extensive documentation to share, that I'd also like to share that documentation with everyone here, so the community could understand what really happened to Henderson Pharmacy. Carol looked uncomfortable, said this wasn't the appropriate venue, that the investigation should be handled privately, tried to walk back the public confrontation she'd initiated. I said she'd made it public, that she'd accused me in front of 500 people, that I had the right to defend myself in front of those same people. The crowd was interested now, sensing drama, wanting to hear both sides. The health fair coordinator came over, asked what was happening. I explained the situation. The coordinator said if this was going to be a public discussion, we should move to the auditorium, let everyone who wanted to hear sit down and listen properly, make it an official forum instead of a chaotic scene at our booth. Carol tried to object, said this wasn't appropriate, but the crowd was already moving towards the auditorium, wanting to hear the story, wanting to understand what had really happened. Thomas arrived with boxes of documents. Ashley, the MedValue tech who'd confessed, was with him. She'd agreed to testify publicly about what Brian had ordered her to do. We moved into the auditorium. Probably 300 people followed us. Local residents, health fair attendees, people curious about the drama. The Millfield newspaper sent a reporter. Local news showed up with cameras. The coordinator gave me and Carol each 10 minutes to present our positions. Said afterward there could be questions and discussion. Turned it into an impromptu public hearing. Carol went first. She presented the complaints against Henderson Pharmacy, the bottles with wrong medications, the patient who'd had the serious allergic reaction, the pattern of safety concerns over several months. She said the board had an obligation to protect public health, that suspending a pharmacy's license was a serious step they didn't take lightly, but that patient safety had to come first, that Henderson Pharmacy's pattern of errors suggested serious problems with their procedures. She didn't mention the sabotage, didn't mention our evidence, presented it like we were genuinely careless and dangerous, like the board was protecting the community from an incompetent pharmacy. Then it was my turn. I started by explaining Henderson Pharmacy's history, 65 years serving Millfield, 3 generations of my family, tens of thousands of prescriptions dispensed safely, a reputation built on trust and competence. I said that everything Carol described had happened, the fake bottles with wrong medications, the serious patient reaction. All of it was real, but that Henderson Pharmacy hadn't created those bottles. We'd been framed. People looked skeptical. A pharmacist claiming he was framed sounded like someone making excuses. Then I showed them the evidence. The forensic analysis showing the fake labels were printed on different equipment than ours. The records showing we'd never actually dispensed the prescriptions in question. The pattern showing all the incidents happened to patients in areas where MedValue was doing aggressive marketing. I explained how we'd suspected sabotage, how we'd hired Marcus to investigate, how he'd found Brian Foster's history of similar situations at previous locations. Then I showed the video. Martha Green's living room camera, Ashley from MedValue swapping real Henderson Pharmacy bottles with fake ones during a medication review. Clear footage of the sabotage in action. The auditorium went completely silent. Everyone watching the video, watching this MedValue employee deliberately plant fake bottles to make it look like Henderson Pharmacy was dangerous. Then Ashley testified, stood up in front of everyone, explained that Brian Foster had ordered her to do it, that he'd been running this scheme for months, that the goal was to destroy Henderson Pharmacy's reputation and drive us out of business so MedValue could dominate the local market. She said she was sorry, that she'd needed her job and was afraid to refuse, that she knew what she was doing was wrong, but felt trapped. that she was testifying now because she couldn't live with the guilt of helping destroy an honest business. People in the audience were angry now, angry at MedValue, angry at Brian Foster, angry that a corporate chain had tried to destroy a family pharmacy through fraud and sabotage. Someone asked where Brian Foster was. I pointed to the back of the auditorium. He was still there, still watching, but his smile was gone. He looked like he wanted to disappear. People started turning around to look at him, recognizing him, realizing he was the villain in this story, the person who'd orchestrated the whole sabotage scheme. Brian tried to leave, but people blocked the exits, said he needed to stay and answer questions, needed to explain himself, needed to face the community he'd tried to manipulate. The coordinator asked if Brian had anything to say, any response to the accusations and evidence. Brian tried to claim he didn't know what Ashley was talking about, that she was lying, that he'd never ordered anyone to create fake prescription bottles, that this was all a misunderstanding. Someone asked if he denied being at Martha Green's house. He said he'd never been there. Martha stood up, said that was a lie, that he'd come to her house personally 2 months ago, trying to get her to switch her prescriptions to MedValue, that he'd been aggressive and inappropriate. Others stood up. Other elderly residents Brian had visited. They'd all been approached by him or his staff, all pressured to switch pharmacies, all told that independent pharmacies weren't as safe as corporate chains. The stories built on each other, painted a picture of systematic harassment, of MedValue targeting Henderson Pharmacy's most vulnerable customers, of a deliberate campaign to destroy a competitor through lies and sabotage. Brian was cornered. No way to explain away the video evidence, no way to defend the testimony of his own employee, no way to deny the pattern of behavior dozens of witnesses were describing. He finally admitted it, not in those words, but he said Henderson Pharmacy was outdated, that small pharmacies couldn't provide the safety and quality of modern corporate chains, that the industry was changing, and businesses that couldn't adapt deserved to fail. He said MedValue had just accelerated the inevitable, that Henderson Pharmacy would have closed eventually anyway, that they'd just helped push us toward that conclusion. The auditorium erupted, people shouting at Brian, calling him unethical, demanding he leave town, some calling for his arrest. The coordinator restored order, asked Carol Williams what the State Board of Pharmacy planned to do about this. Carol looked uncomfortable. She'd clearly been blindsided by the evidence, had thought she was investigating legitimate safety concerns, now realized she'd been manipulated, that her investigation had been based on fabricated evidence. Carol said she needed to review the evidence more carefully. That based on what she'd just seen, it appeared Henderson Pharmacy had been the victim of a coordinated sabotage campaign, that the board would immediately lift the license suspension, that they'd be opening an investigation into MedValue and Brian Foster for fraud and endangering public safety. She apologized to me, said the board had acted on what appeared to be legitimate complaints, that they had an obligation to investigate safety concerns, but that they should have been more thorough before taking public action, that I was owed an apology for how this had been handled. Then Carol turned to Brian, asked if he understood that creating counterfeit prescription bottles was not only unethical, but criminal, that he'd endangered patients by distributing medications under false labels, that people could have died from taking the wrong medications because of his scheme. Brian said nothing, just stood there looking defeated. The county sheriff was at the health fair. He'd been watching from the back. Now he came forward, said based on what he'd just heard and seen, he had probable cause to arrest Brian Foster for fraud and reckless endangerment. Read him his rights, handcuffed him in front of 300 people. The auditorium applauded as Brian was led out, applauded for Henderson Pharmacy, for the truth coming out, for justice being served. After Brian was removed, people came up to me, apologized for doubting us, said they'd been fooled by MedValue's campaign, said they wanted to bring their prescriptions back to Henderson Pharmacy, said they valued what we'd been doing for 3 generations and didn't want to see us close. Mrs. Peterson was crying, said she felt guilty for ever doubting us, that she'd known my grandfather and father and me for 40 years and should have trusted that we'd never compromise patient safety. I told her there was nothing to feel guilty about, that the evidence against us had looked convincing because it was designed to look convincing, that MedValue had been very sophisticated in their sabotage, that anyone would have had doubts. Mr. Garcia said something that stuck with me. He said the difference between Henderson Pharmacy and MedValue wasn't just about family versus corporate, it was about relationship versus transaction. that we knew our patients, and they knew us. That trust wasn't just about getting the right pills. It was about knowing the person behind the counter cared about your health and your well-being. He said MedValue had tried to make pharmacy purely transactional. Get your pills, pay your copay, leave. No relationship, no personal knowledge, just efficiency and convenience. And in doing so, they'd destroyed the thing that made pharmacy valuable beyond just dispensing medications. The next few weeks were intense. The story went viral locally. Small-town pharmacy fights back against corporate sabotage. Local news covered it extensively. The Columbus Dispatch ran a feature article. Several pharmacy industry publications wrote about it. MedValue Corporate issued a statement, said they were shocked and appalled by Brian Foster's actions, that he'd been acting alone without corporate knowledge or approval, that they'd terminated him immediately, that they'd cooperate fully with investigations. But nobody believed them. Brian had done this at multiple locations. There was a pattern. Either corporate knew and approved, or they were so negligent in supervising their managers that it amounted to the same thing. The Ohio State Board of Pharmacy opened a full investigation into MedValue's practices. Other states where MedValue operated started their own investigations. The company's stock price dropped 20%. They faced lawsuits from multiple independent pharmacies in different towns. Within 3 months, MedValue had closed half their stores. By 6 months, they'd filed for bankruptcy. The Millfield location closed in September. The building sat empty. Brian Foster was prosecuted, pleaded guilty to fraud and reckless endangerment, got 3 years in prison and was permanently barred from working in pharmacy. Ashley, who'd cooperated and testified, got probation and community service. Our lawsuit against MedValue was settled. Can't disclose the amount due to confidentiality agreements, but it was substantial, enough to cover our losses during the suspension, enough to invest in expanding Henderson Pharmacy's services, enough to secure our financial future, but more importantly, our customers came back. The publicity had actually helped. People saw us as the underdog who'd fought back against corporate manipulation, as the honest family business that had been victimized but vindicated, as David versus Goliath, and David had won. Our prescription volume recovered to pre-MedValue levels by October, exceeded them by December. We hired 2 additional staff members, expanded our services, added medication therapy management for chronic diseases, started a program for helping uninsured patients access affordable medications. Emma is in pharmacy school now, Ohio State, same as me and my father. She's planning to come back to Millfield after graduation, 4th-generation Henderson pharmacist. The tradition continues. Lisa says what happened was the worst thing for our business, that it forced us to prove our value, that it showed the community what made us different from corporate chains, that we came out stronger because people understood what they'd almost lost. The community health fair this year was different. Henderson Pharmacy's booth was packed. People wanted to tell us they appreciated us, wanted to say they were glad we'd survived, wanted to make sure we knew they valued what we did. I gave a short speech, thanked everyone for their support during the crisis, talked about what small-town pharmacy meant, about knowing your patients, about being part of the healthcare team, about the relationship that made pharmacy more than just a transaction. Talked about my grandfather opening Henderson Pharmacy in 1959, about his vision of being a community pharmacist, about personal service and professional care, about building trust over decades. I said that trust had been tested, that MedValue had tried to destroy it through lies and sabotage, but that the community had ultimately chosen relationship over transaction, had chosen to support the pharmacy that knew them rather than the chain that just processed prescriptions. I said we'd never take that trust for granted, that we'd keep earning it every day, that Henderson Pharmacy would continue serving Millfield for generations to come. The audience applauded, not polite applause, real, sustained applause that went on for almost a minute. People standing, some crying, everyone showing that they valued what we represented. After the speech, Carol Williams came up to me. She apologized again, said the board had been too quick to act on MedValue's complaints, that they should have been more skeptical of a pattern that emerged right after a corporate competitor entered the market. She said the board had changed their procedures because of our case, that they now looked more carefully at complaints that might be commercially motivated, that they verified evidence more thoroughly before taking public action, that what happened to us had made them better at their jobs. I appreciated that, The system had failed us initially, but it had ultimately worked. The truth came out, justice was served, and improvements were made so other pharmacies wouldn't face the same situation. Last month, the old MedValue building was bought by a medical practice. 3 doctors who wanted to open a family medicine clinic. They asked if Henderson Pharmacy would partner with them, co-locate in the building, create an integrated healthcare facility. We agreed. We're renovating part of the building now. Henderson Pharmacy will have a larger, modern space, still maintain our Main Street location for convenience, but also have presence in the medical building, work closely with the doctors, coordinate care for patients. It's what my grandfather envisioned, pharmacists as part of the healthcare team, working alongside physicians, providing continuity of care, knowing patients and their complete health picture. Emma is excited about it, says when she graduates, she wants to focus on clinical pharmacy services, medication therapy management, chronic disease management, working directly with the doctors to optimize patient outcomes. I told her that's what pharmacy should be, not just dispensing pills, but using pharmaceutical expertise to improve health, being a healthcare provider, not just a retailer. She said that's what Henderson Pharmacy had always been. That's why we'd survived when MedValue hadn't, because we'd never forgotten that pharmacy is healthcare, not commerce. I think about Brian Foster sometimes, about what drove him to sabotage us so deliberately. Was it just business pressure? Desperation to hit corporate targets? Or something more personal? Did he genuinely believe that independent pharmacies were obsolete and he was accelerating inevitable change? I don't know. And I guess it doesn't matter. What matters is that we survived, that the community chose to support us, that truth and evidence defeated lies and manipulation. But I also think about how close we came to losing everything. If we hadn't hired Marcus to investigate, if we hadn't set up the sting operation with Martha, if we hadn't caught Ashley on camera swapping bottles, we would have been destroyed by accusations we couldn't disprove. That terrifies me, because for every situation where the truth comes out, there might be dozens where it doesn't, where small businesses are destroyed by false accusations they can't defend against, where corporate competitors eliminate competition through sabotage that's never discovered. We were lucky to be skeptical early, lucky to have resources to investigate, lucky to catch them in the act. Not every small business would be that lucky. That's why I've been speaking out, talking to other independent pharmacists about what happened to us, sharing our story, teaching them to watch for similar patterns, helping them understand how corporate competitors might use complaints and safety accusations as weapons. Several pharmacies have contacted me, said they experienced similar situations, mysterious safety complaints after a chain opened nearby, pressure from state boards based on accusations they couldn't explain. They'd thought they were isolated incidents. Now they wonder if they were targeted too. The pharmacy industry is watching our case. Henderson Pharmacy versus MedValue has become a cautionary tale about corporate sabotage, about the importance of documentation, about fighting back against false accusations, about the value of community support. Some corporate chains are angry, say we're painting all chains as villains, that most chain pharmacies operate ethically, that Brian Foster was an aberration, that we're unfairly damaging the reputation of corporate pharmacy. Maybe they're right. Maybe most chains are ethical, but the structure creates incentives for what Brian did. When regional managers are under intense pressure to hit targets, when underperforming stores face closure, when eliminating local competition is the fastest path to meeting goals, the temptation to use unethical tactics is built into the system. Independent pharmacies don't have that problem. We're not trying to dominate markets or hit corporate targets. We're trying to serve our communities and make a decent living. Success means having enough customers to sustain the business, not capturing 90% market share. That fundamental difference matters. It shapes how we operate, how we compete, how we treat patients and competitors. I'm 48 years old. I've been a pharmacist for 26 years. I own Henderson Pharmacy, founded by my grandfather in 1959. I almost lost everything because a corporate competitor tried to destroy me through sabotage and fraud. But I didn't lose everything, because I documented what we did, because I investigated when things didn't make sense, because I fought back with evidence and truth, because my community ultimately chose relationship over transaction. Brian Foster tried to prove that independent pharmacies were obsolete, that corporate chains were inevitable. that businesses like mine couldn't compete in the modern market. He was wrong. We're still here, still serving Millfield, still providing the personal care that corporate chains can't match, still proving that pharmacy is healthcare, not just commerce. And we'll be here for another generation. Emma will take over someday, maybe her children after her, the Henderson family serving Millfield, 3 generations down, maybe 5 or 6 to come. That's what Brian couldn't understand, that some things are worth more than profit, that relationships built over decades matter, that trust earned through 3 generations of honest service can withstand even the most sophisticated attacks. Corporate chains come and go. They open, they close, they rebrand, they file bankruptcy, their transactions and quarterly reports and stock prices, but family businesses endure because they're built on something more than profit, built on reputation and relationship and community, built on caring about the people you serve because they're your neighbors, not just your customers. That's what saved Henderson Pharmacy, not our evidence or our lawsuit or our investigation. Those things proved our innocence. But what saved us was the community deciding we were worth saving, deciding that what we'd built over 65 years mattered, deciding that relationship was more valuable than convenience. Brian Foster, with all his corporate resources and sophisticated sabotage, couldn't defeat that, because you can't sabotage trust built over 3 generations. You can damage it temporarily, but if the foundation is strong, it rebuilds. And ours was strong, is strong. Will stay strong as long as Henderson Pharmacy remembers what my grandfather knew in 1959. That pharmacy isn't about pills, it's about people. It's about caring for your community. It's about being there when people need you. That's the Henderson way. That's what we almost lost. That's what we fought to save. And that's what we'll protect for generations to come. Did you like my story? Which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next story with love and respect.